Dr. Keith Plummer will be delivering our lecture this evening, and this will mark the second annual Virtue Ethics Lecture. The Virtue Ethics Lecture Series Endowed Fund was established last year by Dr. Richard and Mrs. Elizabeth Zimmerman in memory of their parents, Dr. Willis and Mrs. Janice Zimmerman, and Mr. Henry and Mrs. Anna Wellhausen, because of their display of the virtues of generosity, kindness, and faithfulness. These virtues reflected the fruit of the Holy Spirit and impacted their family, friends, churches, neighbors, and community. We are deeply grateful to the Zimmerman family for establishing this endowed fund, which allows for this lectureship to be an ongoing part of each year's conference. Thank you. I remember Dr. Plummer as something of a casual acquaintance, perhaps, from my first time working here at CBHD 20 years ago, which is hard to believe. But I believe that the last time I saw Keith was in New York about 2012. Jennifer Law, who some of you know, Jennifer Law and I co-wrote a documentary film called Anonymous Father's Day on the effects of conception by anonymous sperm donation on those who are conceived by this technique. And we held a screening at a digital art gallery in Soho. Keith came over from Philadelphia for the screening, and it really meant a lot to both of us that he made the time to be there. So thank you for that. Dr. Plummer is Dean of the School of Divinity at Cairn University, where he's been a faculty member since 2010. He previously served as an associate pastor at Our Savior Evangelical Free Church, just right around the corner, basically, in Wheeling for 18 years. He's written chapters in the book Before You Lose Your Faith, Deconstructing Doubt in the Church, and in the book The Digital Public Square, Christian Ethics in a Technological Society, which was edited by Jason Thacker, who is here and will be talking tomorrow afternoon. Dr. Plummer has a very active Twitter or X account, and if you're not on Twitter, don't start now. But if you are, he's definitely worth following. He regularly posts thoughtful quotes from books that he's reading. He posts his own perspectives on technology, apologetics, and faith, and his daily Wordle score. So for one reason or another, it's worth following him to just keep up. So please welcome Dr. Plummer.
Thank you very much, Matthew, for everything except mentioning my activity on X. But if you want to talk to me about that afterwards, we can. Good evening. It is a joy to be on campus again. I have immense gratitude for the education and the relationships that I have experienced here. I was introduced to my favorite hymn in this chapel during my first chapel service as a new Master's of Divinity student. I was already filled with an array of emotions and apprehensions. And then the pipe organ began to play, and it swelled with a melody that I had never heard before, but I liked. And I joined my voice with those of others singing words that so clearly captured the gospel. And can it be? I cannot and do not sing that song without thinking about Trinity. The Trinity, of course, but then this Trinity. I am very, very grateful. I'm also grateful to the people and resources of the Center for Bioethics and Human Dignity for their part in my formation and education. I had the privilege and the pleasure of studying under John Kilner and Ben Mitchell, of reading and conversing with people like Paige Cunningham, Mike Sleesman, Hans Madueme, Matthew Epinette, And that interaction proved invaluable to me in my time in pastoral ministry, and it continues to be a resource upon which I draw now that I am in the world of higher Christian education. And because of that indebtedness to and respect for the people and the work of CBHD, it means a great, great deal to me. It's a tremendous honor, and I am most grateful for the invitation to speak to you this evening about a topic that I think is really, really critical for the times in which God has providentially placed us. Discipled by our devices, spiritual formation in our technological age. But before we do that, I'd like to say a few words about technology as it relates to the Bible. I teach a class at Cairn called Technology and Christian Discipleship, and oftentimes students take it because they think that what we're going to be talking about is how to use technology to disciple people. And while that is something of what we're doing, I want to do something more. I want to look at how do we situate technology in the sweep of the biblical story. And so, just some preliminary words before we get into the meat of what I'd like us to talk about. John Dyer, who teaches at Dallas Theological Seminary, has a wonderful book called From the Garden to the City, The Place of Technology in the Story of God, in which he offers a succinct definition of technology with respect to biblical revelation. And this is it: the human activity of using tools to transform God's creation for practical purposes. Now, you'll note a few things there. He's talking about technology as a human activity, though we might also talk about technology, and we're probably more familiar with speaking of technology with respect to the gadgets, the hardware, the products, and that is another thinking about technology. But it is right, too, to say that technology is a human activity, and an activity that is involved with transforming God's creation for practical ends. But didn't God create everything good? And if, in fact, he did create everything good, then why would we at all want to be transforming it? Well, the purpose is that while God did create everything good, he created that which he made with latent potential. And in order for us to be what God has created us to be and to fulfill the mission that God has called us to, it is necessary for us to be engaged in technological activity, according to this definition: the human activity of using tools to transform God's creation for practical purposes. My reason for saying that is grounded in the words that we encounter in the beginning of Genesis, which theologians are fond of calling the cultural mandate. When God calls humanity to exercise dominion over the earth, implicit within that is the idea of utilizing their creativity, their imagination, and so forth, so as to bring out the potentialities that are inherent within what God has made. And therefore, the technological impulse, I would argue, is a part of creation. We've got to situate it somewhere, and either we have to say that the technological impulse is a result of the fall, which is problematic for a number of reasons, but I would say technology is rooted in our being image bearers of God who are called to exercise dominion over the earth so as to reflect him and his glory in the world. And when I talk with my students about this, I tell them that it's really important for us to get this right. Because If we don't, we run the risk of going to two extremes, neither of which is good. We talk about how it is that the technological impulse is rooted in creation, but we also talk about the effects of the fall on the technological impulse. So the impulse itself is not sinful, but the things that we do with the impulse often are. There's a phrase that Paul uses of the Gentiles that I think is fascinating. He says that they are inventors of evil. What fascinates me about that is that creativity, that imagination, that innovation is part of the goodness of creation. Nevertheless, it is misdirected such that it is in opposition to God. And if we understand technology as Dyer defines it, and we understand that it is rooted in creation and that there are effects of the fall on it, that can keep us from these two poles, either demonizing technology, which is to uncritically just reject technology out of hand and say all technology is bad, or to devour it, to be uncritical in our use of it, to be intent on whatever is new, using it without any critical reflection. At Cairn University, all of our students have to take apologetics as part of their required curriculum, and they do that in either their junior or their senior year. Each semester, I get to teach 2 of 3 sections, and I introduce one of the subjects that we discuss by asking students to look out the classroom windows and begin verbally listing everything they can that they see. It usually takes some time to get them going, but once 1 or 2 start, the list goes on and on, consisting of things like people, buildings, cars, the parking lot, birds, trees, dogs, grass, clouds, sunshine or rain, and an assortment of other things depending on what's going on outside at the time. After I bring the exercise to a close, or at least I try to, I tell them, and most often this is true, there's one thing that you saw that you didn't name. Anyone know what that is? The pane of glass. It was clearly in their line of vision, but what was happening was they were looking through it, not at it. And therefore, they didn't take it into account. I use that illustration to introduce an argument against naturalism that C.S. Lewis makes in his book Miracles, in which he argues that our capacity to reason, to draw inferences, to make deductions, is strong evidence that naturalism, the philosophy that nature or that matter is all that exists, is wrong, and reason itself actually points to something beyond nature that Lewis calls supernature. And he reasons that if supernature is part of the sum total of reality, then of course miracles are possible. I think it's a compelling argument. It's one of my favorites, but I'm going to spare you further elaboration on it because that's not what I was asked to come to talk about. But I tell you that story to illustrate the fact that we can easily become oblivious to that which we have come to take for granted due to familiarity and frequent usage. The point I hope to make with my students is that reason is something that every day we use, we see through, yet something about which we rarely, if ever, give any serious thought. What we're going to do today, I tell them, and what Lewis does in his chapter, is look at what we are accustomed to looking through. Reason itself. And this evening, I'd like to lead us in an examination of our digital and information technologies and the media we use them to access with a view toward their formative powers and the challenges they pose to our aim of being conformed to the image of Christ. They are not all that old, yet they have become so interwoven into the fabric of our lives that it requires some degree of mental energy to recall life before them or to imagine life without them. Referring to the digital revolution in his book, A Web of Our Own Making, The Nature of Digital Formation, Anton Barbacay notes, "Never has such change been struck so fast. The printing press and firearms were technological watersheds with world historical implications, but they took decades or centuries to assimilate. Digital technology has, by contrast, so changed human life within a couple of decades that teens are today growing up in an altogether cultural environment with different expectations, habits, and standard points of orientation from their parents. There is now arguably a greater chasm between someone age 12 and someone age 50, or 40, or 30, than there ever was between people separated by a millennium of pharaonic rule in ancient Egypt." And while it could be argued that the so-called digital natives have been most impacted by this digital revolution, it's not only them. Our digital tools have become what we think and communicate with and through. They have become what Neil Postman called mythic. In a lecture he gave to religious leaders in 1998 called 5 Things We Need to Know About Technological Change, Postman said that media have a tendency to become mythic and explained, quote, "I use the word in the sense in which it was used by the French literary critic Roland Barthes. He used the word myth to refer to a common tendency to think of our technological creations as if they were God-given, as if they were a part of the natural order of things. I have on occasion asked my students," he writes, "if they know when the alphabet was invented. The question astonishes them. It is as if I asked them when clouds and trees were invented. The alphabet, they believe, was not something that was invented. It just is. It is this way with many products of human culture, but with none more consistently than technology. Cars, planes, TV, movies, newspapers, they have achieved mythic status because they are perceived as gifts of nature, not as artifacts produced in a specific political and historical context." Postman warned that it is always dangerous when a technology rises to that status of being mythic, because, he said, it is then accepted as it is, and is therefore not easily susceptible to modification or control. If you should propose to the average American that television broadcasting should not begin until 5 p.m. and should cease at 11 p.m., keep in mind he's saying this in 1998, or propose that there should be no television commercials, he will think the idea ridiculous, but not because he disagrees with your cultural agenda. He will think it ridiculous because he assumes you are proposing that something in nature be changed, as if you were suggesting that the sun should rise at 10 a.m. instead of 6. Caution is necessary when a technology reaches mythic status, because when it does, we find it virtually impossible to conceive of it being other than it is, and then we are at our most vulnerable. The conventions and forms of life that grow up around and over them quickly become uncontestable second nature. Barbara Kay says, "What is not claimed by open clarity is what dominates us. What is unthought and unsaid is what is all-powerful." To put a slight twist on Socrates' dictum, the examined digital life is worth living. What are the impacts of our increasing inhabitation of the virtual world on the formation and or deformation of virtue? How might our devices be inclining us to vices? And what measures must we take if we are to live more faithfully as disciples of Jesus and less so as disciples of our electronic tools? Michael Sakasis is the executive director of the Christian Studies Center of Gainesville, and he's someone whose reflection on technology and society I greatly appreciate. In a brief post titled "The Shape of Our Tools, the Shape of Our Souls," he wrote, "To be human is to both shape and be shaped by the world we inhabit. But what is the shape to which our tools and devices encourage us to conform? Who or what do we seek to please by the way we use them? Do they sustain our humanity or erode it? These are the questions we do well to ask." Yes, it would do us well to ask such questions, but what prevents us from asking them more frequently, if at all? Several things come to mind, though the list is by no means exhaustive, and I must be brief with each of them, but the first one that I think about is that, particularly as we're talking about evangelical Christianity, we have a tendency to be pragmatic, to think about what will work, what will get the job done. There is a history of evangelicalism being early adopters of emergent technologies for the sake of the gospel, and that is a good motivation. But when that kind of engagement is done hastily or unthinkingly, then we would do well to pay heed to the words of Postman in his Technopoly. The question, what will a new technology do, is no more important than the question, what will a new technology undo? Indeed, the latter question is more important, precisely because it is asked so infrequently. A new technology comes on the market and we're immediately captivated, enthralled with what can we do with this? Postman says there's another question that is so infrequently asked that is so important. What will this undo? Another reason I think that we don't ask the kinds of questions that Sakasis suggests is that our technologies have acclimated us to habits of mind not conducive to the kind of reflection we need to think about them. To the extent that we are distracted and hasty in our thought, we will not have the mental power to think deeply enough about the technologies that we are using. And another reason that we don't ask these questions is that we derive some measure of pleasure and convenience from our technologies that asking such questions might interfere with. As Upton Sinclair said, it is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it. But regardless of the cost, if we believe that there is nothing better for us and our neighbors than walking in accord with God's ways, and if we are striving to please Him in all that we do, then we cannot and should not shy away from asking these kinds of questions. Alan Noble, in his excellent book, Disruptive Witness, Speaking Truth in a Distracted Age, rightly says, to live well in a modern world requires constant reassessment of how our society and technology are shaping us. We should be open to taking drastic steps to reject practices and habits that we believe are destructive and evil, but the vast majority of innovations will not be so clear-cut. And we will have to weigh benefits, purposes, and damaging effects individually and communally. And a final reason that we don't ask the kinds of questions that we might admit it would do us well to ask is that there are sociocultural pressures that make asking such questions uncomfortable. Who wants to go against the grain? Perhaps at some point you have seen some form of this meme. There's a guy in this coffee shop sitting at a table, not on his phone, not on a laptop, just drinking coffee like a psychopath. What is that getting at? Well, there are just norms and habits, conventions that are taken as givens, and if you should deviate from them, you now become suspect. Or, that's him, the last person without a cell phone. He's impossible to get hold of unless he's at home. Let's get him. Samuel D. James has said that cell phones have not only made us reachable, but they have created a moral imperative of reachability. You ought to be reachable. And if you are not, then you should suffer. A disciple is one who learns, one who places himself under the instruction and mentorship of another, a teacher or mentor. As I was working on this message, I was repeatedly reminded that while Microsoft Word acknowledges the legitimacy of the noun form of disciple, it has no tolerance whatsoever for the other noun form, discipler, or the verb form, to disciple. But these are common and good terms in Christian circles. To be discipled is to learn. To be a discipler is to teach. Both require agency and intention. So when I speak of our being discipled by our devices, I don't mean to attribute either agency or intention to our digital devices themselves. And by speaking of them as virtue or vice forming, neither do I mean to attribute moral agency to them. Our smartphones, laptops, tablets, and other devices are not persons, and moral agency is only properly ascribed to personal moral agents. When I describe my phone as being good, I certainly don't mean that in terms of ethics. I could be referring to its quality, its capabilities, or its affordability, but I wouldn't be praising it in the sense of it being righteous, upright, or just. In one sense, it is therefore accurate to say that our digital tools are in themselves neither moral nor immoral. Certainly, they can be put to moral and immoral uses, but they are in themselves void of the moral attribution. However, it doesn't follow from that they are in all ways neutral. This is a point that numerous media theorists have made repeatedly, and one which I fear Christians have been slow to hear. It has been our tendency to assess technologies almost solely on the basis of the uses to which they are put, with little to no thought to the ways in which our technological tools and the conventions that grow up around them may be shaping us. The reasoning usually goes something like this: inanimate tools are neither good nor evil, and therefore all that matters is how we use them. In the philosophy of technology, this is called an instrumentalist view, that the tool is simply an instrument of the user, and it can easily be switched out with some other tool without there being any difficulty. In contrast to that, there is what is called technological determinism, which affords to technologies an almost autonomous power, and seemingly one that robs humans of all agency. To again quote John Dyer, do humans have agency? Determinism says no, essentially arguing that technology operates independently of human choices. According to technological determinism, technology is ultimately responsible for what we do. It makes us behave as we do. This is clearly not an option for a biblically informed view of human persons. All things are laid bare and open before the eyes of him with whom we, not our devices, have to do. Fortunately, we don't have to choose between the instrumentalism and determinism. We must reject determinism, for it's treating humans as less than God has made us, morally culpable beings. But we cannot embrace instrumentalism, for it fails to acknowledge the complexity of the interplay between the shaping potential that our technologies have on our individual and collective imaginations, expectations, conceptualizations about what constitutes the good life and our behaviors. Christian sociologist Felicia Wu Song, in her book Restless Devices, notes, though technological affordances certainly do not determine human behavior, it is important to recognize how they create environments that make some worlds and behaviors more imaginable and achievable than others. In other words, our devices cast visions of the ways that life should be. Neil Postman said in Technopoly, embedded in every tool is an ideological bias, a predisposition to construct the world as one thing rather than another, to value one thing over another, to amplify one sense or skill or attitude more loudly than another. And Nicholas Carr in The Shallow said, every tool imposes limitations even as it opens possibilities. The more we use it, the more we mold ourselves to its form and function. An honest appraisal of any new technology or of progress in general requires a sensitivity to what's lost as well as what is gained. We shouldn't allow the glories of technology to blind our inner watchdog to the possibility that we've numbed an essential part of ourself. So what I would like to do in the time remaining is just to look at 3 areas that our inhabitation of the technological world can train us in, can turn us to think in certain ways that I would say are antagonistic to the kingdom of God. And these are attention, autonomy, and then because I couldn't decide how I wanted to say it, I put all 3: humanity, embodiment, finitude. Multiple factors are responsible for my interest in the relationship between theology, spirituality, and digital technology, but one that stands out in my recollection is reading Nicholas Carr's 2008 article in The Atlantic, "Is Google Making Us Stupid? What the Internet is Doing to Our Brains." In it, Carr described the troubling changes he detected in himself, particularly with respect to his reading habits since being online. He says, "My mind isn't going, so far as I can tell, but it's changing. I'm not thinking the way I used to think. I can feel it most strongly when I'm reading. Immersing myself in a book or a lengthy article used to be easy. My mind would get caught up in the narrative or the turns of the argument, and I'd spend hours strolling through long stretches of prose. That's rarely the case anymore. Now my concentration often starts to drift after 2 or 3 pages. I get fidgety, lose the thread, begin looking for something else to do. I feel as if I'm always dragging my wayward brain back to the text. The deep reading that used to come naturally has become a struggle." I could so resonate with that when I read that, because I too used to be able to stay down in a book. And when I read this, I was just like, wow, someone is putting words to what I'm experiencing. But there was one vivid word picture that he used that had a profound impact on me, and it stayed with me ever since. Once I was a scuba diver in the area of words. Now I zip along the surface like a guy on a jet ski. I resonated all too well with what Carr described. And what got me thinking about the significance of an eroding attention on the Christian life. I mean, clearly you see the relevance of what he's saying to our time in the scriptures, attending to God's word, meditating upon it, and so forth. But I soon realized how vital attention is to the entirety of the Christian life, and how obligatory it is for Christians to steward it well. We have a responsibility to steward our attention because it is a gift of God that is to be employed in knowing and enjoying Him, loving Him above all else, and loving our neighbor as ourselves. Bonhoeffer, in his classic book, Life Together, says the first service that one owes to others in the fellowship consists in listening to them. Just as love to God begins with listening to His word, so the beginning of love for the brethren is learning to listen to them. Christians, especially ministers, so often think they must always contribute something when they are in the company of others, that this is the one service they have to render. They forget that listening can be a greater service than speaking. In other words, we must attend to one another. And practices and ways of life that threaten our ability to attend are therefore destructive to the life of discipleship. Well, with respect to autonomy, this independence, I have been reading and profiting from Anton Barbakay's book, A Web of Our Own Making. And I just wanted to share with you some of the things that he has to say, not particularly coming from a Christian point of view, but about how it is that the connected life actually is designed to foster a sense of autonomy. The primary goal of all online services is to reflect your preferences, The constructive feedback between what you see and what you get is the order of the day. To the extent that I associate with others in the online mode, I am in a position from which I may retreat, refrain, abstract myself at any point. There are no or few strings attached. The setting puts a little pressure on the shape of my own desires. The net provides us with the most vivid, powerful, and constant experience of autonomy available to us. And where such an experience plays a greater and greater part in our ordinary practices, it will play a greater role in shaping each of us in its image. How we see and speak to others necessarily changes how we see and what we tell ourselves. We were created to be subservient to God, dependent upon Him, dependent upon one another. We need to give serious thought to the manner in which things that are taken as just the givens of how it is that we interact with others and with our devices may be working against that. That point was brought home to me by listening to a talk that Jamie K.A. Smith, the Christian philosopher, brought out in a talk he gave at Wheaton years back. He was talking about his book, You Are What You Love, and he was talking about the formative effects of the cell phone. And he said, even if you are reading Gospel Coalition content all day on your phone, you are still being shaped to expect that things should be served to you when you want them, how you want them. You see, it's not just a matter of content. It's a matter of form and practice. Well, humanity. In The Shallows, Nicholas Carr describes how new technologies often provide new metaphors for explaining the workings of nature. And he uses the example of cartography, when maps, the technology of map making came about, how that became soon a metaphor for so many other areas of life. We began to map our lives, our social spheres, even our ideas, he says. Under the sway of the mechanical clock, people begin thinking of their brains and their bodies, of the entire universe, in fact, as operating like clockwork. But think about the ways that the digital has become a predominant metaphor for how it is that we even think about ourselves. Anton Barbacay uses a number of examples. I won't read them all, but he talks about how it is that we are just so accustomed to speaking about feedback, being in the loop, making connections, being in sync, processing experiences, downloading information, upgrading or updating aspects of our lives, of storing or retrieving memories, of having or lacking the bandwidth to attend to something, of being triggered, of our mental hardware or of brain power as RAM. And he points out that this kind of language suggests, number one, that we are just our brains, and also that we are essentially passive responders to things that are pressing our buttons. I found an example, interestingly, tweeted out by Elon Musk. A robot parent and child looking at the exhibit of a brain and pointing to it as being the original processor. There is a tragic irony here. We desperately try to create machines with human-like capacities, and we speak of ourselves and each other in more machine-like ways. This is a tragic irony that while we stand in amazement and wonder at our human simulating creations, we fail to exhibit a comparable fascination with humans themselves, the images of God. Our devices have also profoundly impacted our perceptions and conceptions about things like community, location, and friendship. Well, embodiment is a related area here. Samuel James in Digital Liturgies says, "The internet, which dominates our lives as the primary medium through which we encounter most of the world, is an entirely disembodied habitat. Consequently, the internet trains our consciences to think of ourselves and the world in disembodied ways. We do not exist bodily online, but through photos and videos that we carefully manipulate to construct a preferred identity. On social media, our community is not a room full of people physically present whom we can reach out and touch, but a collection of usernames and avatars and timelines. This habitat itself tells us a story that humans are not essentially people with flesh and blood, voices and facial expression, but users whom we can sufficiently know from their words, profile pictures, and shares." You could not ask for a more vivid illustration of the kinds of things that James describes there than Mark Zuckerberg's announcement of the name change of Facebook to Meta and the exuberance with which he declared the coming of the metaverse. I watched that announcement again recently. I want you to hear some of the things that Zuckerberg said. He referred to when he was younger and he had this vision of technology, and he'd be sketching in classroom, and he said, I didn't have the ability to code the stuff and so forth, but he says it was always clear that the dream was to feel present with the people we care about. Isn't that the ultimate promise of technology? To be together with anyone? To be able to teleport anywhere? And to create and experience anything? Together, he says, we can finally put people at the center of our technology and deliver an experience where we are present with each other. We'll all need to work together from the beginning to bring the best possible version of this future to life, a future where with just a pair of glasses, you'll be able to step beyond the physical world and into the kinds of experiences we've been talking about today. It's evident that Zuckerberg's vision of the ideal world is one in which connection and presence are possible without the encumbrance and limitation of our bodies. For real presence, our bodies are, according to him, immaterial, pun intended. This is a Gnostic ideal, but it certainly conflicts with the biblical narrative according to which the triune God created humanity, including our physical finitude, and pronounced it good. And it remains so even after the fall. The problem, according to God, is not physical, but ethical. And in order to redeem and reconcile us rebels, the second person of the Trinity, the Word assumed full humanity, a rational soul, and a body, for, as Gregory of Nazianzus astutely observed, that which he has not assumed has not been healed. And lest you think that this is simply the vision of someone who does not know God, one of the things that I have my students view is an interview with a pastor who is advocating virtual reality church. And saying this is better or just as good as gathering together. We dare not allow ourselves to come to a point where we embrace the idea that our physicality is somehow getting in the way of connection. Spiritual formation in our technological age must be richly biblical and theologically informed. That's not peculiar to our time. That's been critical throughout the century, throughout the history of the church. The people of God in every age are commanded not to conform to the world. There's nothing unique about that imperative to Christians in the technological age. However, as Francis Schaeffer points out in The God Who Is There, we must understand that the world spirit does not always take the same form. So the Christian must resist the spirit of the world in the form it takes in his own generation. If he does not do this, he is not resisting the spirit of the world at all. It's a grievous error to conceive of worldliness solely in terms of gross debauchery and sensuality. In fact, I believe the enemy of our souls is quite pleased that we entertain such a myopic understanding. I know of no better definition of worldliness than that offered by David Wells years ago in his book, Losing Our Virtue. He defined it as that system of values in any given age which has as its center our fallen human perspective, which displaces God and his truth from the world and which makes sin look normal and righteousness seem strange. It thus gives great plausibility to what is morally wrong, and for that reason makes what is wrong seem normal. A vital dimension of spiritual formation, especially in resistance to the ways that we are encouraged to make autonomy and individual preference ultimate values, is that we must be intentionally corporate in addition to personal in our pursuit of holiness. The digital world will only strive to further persuade us to conceive of ourselves primarily as individual consumers, whose every desire should be fulfilled in accordance to our liking. Standing against that lie will require a commitment to deep, rich relationships that help us remain mindful of who we are, why we are, and who life is ultimately for. We need the body of Christ. We need each other. We need to prioritize presence over convenience and efficiency. Jacob Schatzer, theologian, wrote a book called Transhumanism and the Image of God, in which he says, the argument isn't technology shapes us, so avoid technology. We can't do that anyway. At the same time, we must avoid the slippery slope of tools can't tell us what to do, therefore we don't need to think about how they shape us. We just need to use them wisely. Rather, part of responsible, wise, faithful use of tools is analyzing the ways that certain tools shape us to see the world in certain ways, and then to ask whether those ways are consistent with the life of a disciple of Christ. If they aren't, then the answer could be to reject certain tools, or it could be to limit tools in a certain way, or to commit to other forms of life that can strengthen us in our resolve to pursue holiness in light of the many ways our world tempts us off that path. Efficiency, speed, convenience, and choice are the values embedded in our devices and essential to the picture of the good life that they tell. But search for them in the Apostle Paul's description of love in 1 Corinthians 13, or his description of the fruit of the Spirit in Galatians 5, and you will not find them. Because those are not the marks of love. In their proper place, they are good, but when they arise to the level of virtues, as our devices and those who create them would have us think, we are at odds with the kingdom of God. Thank you.